Nilo tempore dicet Iesus discipulis suis, sint glumbi vestri fecicti, et lucernia dentis manibus vestris, et vos similes hominibus expectatibus Dominum suum quando revertatur a nupsis, ut convenerit et postabili confessum aperiant ei. Beati servi idi quos convenerit Dominus invenderi vigilantes, abenico vobis quae precintet se, et facet iris ascumbere, et transiens milis trabitiris. Et si venerit in secundo vigilia, si interite vigilia venerit, et ita in venerit beati sunt servi idi. O cadem si toti quanem si sere pater familias, qua ora fur venire vigilare tutique, et non sinere perfidi domum sua. Et vestes toti parati, quia qua ora non putatis, filius omnis veniat.
Laatste de Christus.
And he is a protector for all those who await him. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Our Lady of Mount Carmel,
Pray for us.
St. Pius X,
Pray for us.
St. Francis of Assisi.
Pray for us.
So today, as I said, this is a Franciscan feast day, in which three are commemorated, one saint and two blesseds. We see in this life, the three lives, I should say, the theme of the expectation, the awaiting of God. So you might ask yourself during the Holy Mass, what are you waiting for? What is the particular driving force that is motivating you toward your goal? What is your goal, in fact? You see in these three Franciscans a common goal, that is eternal life, the life of the blessed, because it's the only thing that makes sense for the life of these three religious. Because in the eyes of the world, it's an insanity why they would go through the things that they went. They weren't martyrs, it is true, but all three lived lives of great penance, great mortification, and great charity, in fact, toward the neighbor. And that only makes sense when you see why they are living. And so you see at the end of the epistle, which is from Ecclesiasticus, it says that the Lord is protector of all those who are awaiting him in truth. That is, they didn't just pretend to be Catholics. They didn't just sort of go through the motions of being Catholics. And we can apply that no matter what our state of life is. That is, we ask ourselves, what are we here for? What is the driving force? Saint Giles Mary of St. Joseph, the canonized one of the three, he died in 1812. He came from a very poor family near Naples, and he couldn't even read or write. He was completely illiterate. When he was a little boy, his father died, and so he had to help support the family. And he was a rope maker during his early years, until such time as he knew that God was wanting something more of him. And so he had already had a great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. He went daily to Holy Mass, and in the morning and then in the evening, he would go and spend time always in front of the Blessed Sacrament. One day when he was 25 years old, he had answered as far as what God wanted of him, because St. Peter of Alcantara and St. Pascal Bailon, two Spanish Franciscan saints, appeared to him, and they told him to enter into the Franciscan order. So he went to the monastery in Naples, other Franciscans, and he asked admittance, first to be a priest. But the problem was he couldn't read or write at all, and so he was not deemed fit as far as a priesthood, not because of morality, but simply because he didn't have the basics, or he could do what was required of him. And so he entered as a lay brother, a professed brother, that is, a religious brother, and took his vows. He was a man of great charity toward the poor. He was the one who went out and begged on behalf of the convent. And his motto when he begged was very simple. Love God, he said. Wherever he went, that was his motto when he asked of alms for his priory. And not only for his priory, but also for the poor, because they came to his monastery, where he was porter as well, and asked for alms. And so originally his name was Giles Mary, because of his devotion to Our Lady. But when the poor came and begged at the monastery of him to ask for food, for the necessities always were there. No matter, and they were a poor monastery because they were the discalced Franciscans, following the reform of St. Peter of Alcantara, the observants, they were called. So they didn't have a surplus of food, but somehow when people came, there was always food. St. Joseph always managed for them, for St. Giles Mary, to provide the food necessary for the poor. And so he added to his name the name of St. Joseph in honor of St. Joseph. After a life of great charity toward the poor, not only giving food, but he carried a little image of Our Lady of the Well to the poor, the sick, I mean, to heal them. After a life, he died finally in 1812, and after that, there were miracles attributed to him, especially the poor, sick, I mean, the healing of the sick. The second one of these three who lived for God was Blessed Ruzziero of Muccia. He came from quite the opposite extreme of things. He was not born a poor peasant, as St. Giles Mary, but he was born an aristocrat. He came from a noble family, and in 1220, he was in Bologna as a student at the University of Bologna, where he was studying, as many of the well-to-do did, in order to enter into various things they could get into. He was not planning, I don't think, to enter into the church, particularly. Bologna was a center of law, ecclesiastical and civil law. So he was there, and one day St. Francis came into the city of Bologna in 1220, and he preached a great sermon, and the entire city went out to see him because he already had a great reputation for holiness. And the theme of his sermon was very simple. It was about the supernatural things, about demons, about angels, and about man. And the sermon was preached in order to reconcile men one to another, because Italy in the Middle Ages could be a very violent place. It was like the Hatfields and McCoys times 100 in Italy. The clans were all against each other within the cities, and that was the case in Bologna too. And he preached a sermon which reconciled many to not only to God but to each other. The feuds ended after this sermon. It made a huge impression. And one of the people that was there was this student, Ruzziero de Muccia, who heard St. Francis, and instead of proceeding on to wealth or status, he asked St. Francis to enter into his order, to give all things up for God. And so he did. St. Francis made a prophecy then and told him that he would be a priest and he would be a great preacher, and also that he would do great things for the order, all of which came true. However, God wanted to test Blessed Ruggiero by allowing great temptations to afflict him. So even though he was very pious, he was very austere, did great penances, these did not remove the temptations from him. And so, though he was a great director of souls, he became more and more despondent, so that he came to believe that perhaps he was rejected by God, and that St. Francis no longer cared for him. And so, miraculously, St. Francis, who by this time was near his death in Assisi, sent two friars to him, because he knew by divine inspiration what was going on in the soul of this man. And meanwhile, at the same time, Blessed Ruggiero decided, since he had reached near the end of his rope, that he was going to talk to St. Francis, and he began to walk to Assisi. And there he was met by the two who told him to come, that St. Francis wanted to see him. And so he came to the bed where St. Francis was lying gravely ill. St. Francis rose up, embraced him, and told him, in fact, that he was beloved. In fact, the first message that he got from the Briars, had to do with that he was one of the beloved of St. Francis. And St. Francis told him that God was now going to free him of this temptation that he had, but that was necessary for the gaining of grace, the gaining of virtue and merit on the part of Blessed Ruggiero. And so he died in sanctity, and miracles happened at his tomb. The third one of the three is very interesting, in fact. Another aristocrat. He was Blessed Anthony that's a very odd name. Strocone. So Blessed Anthony Strocone also was an aristocrat. His parents were third order Franciscans. He died in the 1400s. And in his case, he was wanting to be religious at a very young age. When he was 12 years old, he went to the monastery and asked to enter But of course, they told him, "You're a little young for this. You're too delicate. You're too young. You need to wait." But he entered anyway. He kept on asking and asking and asking. And so he was received into the order at 13 years old, into the Franciscan order. Because he came from a very good family, he certainly didn't have a problem about reading or writing or whatever. They wanted him to become a priest. But out of humility, he would not. And he wanted to only be a simple lay brother within the order. And so he entered the order and he began to study the spiritual life. He became assistant master of novices in his convent. And then he retired into a life of solitude, sort of. There was nothing great, particularly on the outside of this blessed. At the beginning, he devoted himself to prayer, to acts of penance, to mortification, but in a kind of silence way. He was not in front of everybody, though he did also go out and beg food for the monastery. He was in the order for 68 years before he died in his 80s in 1471. And then began a great number of miracles. 1 year after his death, he was buried, by the way, in a common grave. And the friars used to bury the brethren under the church. Within the church, the tiles were opened up and they were buried in a common grave. So 1 year after that, there was a saint there, in fact, living, St. James of the Marches. He was a great reformer of the Franciscan order. And while St. James was at this friary, he saw in the church a fire was coming out from under the church where the friars were buried. And so he ordered that the tiles be lifted up to examine what was happening under, because he knew that God had done this. This was a miraculous thing. And so when they opened up the tiles, he was found, the blessed Anthony was found completely incorrupt. And there was a sweet smell that came out of the tomb. Well, when that happened, he was taken out and put in another place, a separate place, a sepulcher, and many miracles for this, again, regarding the sick happened. And not only that, but there began to be signs coming from the tomb. Every time one of the community was near death, there was a knocking sound from within the urn where the body was. And that happened all the way until a final miracle happened in in the 1600s, later part of the 1600s. And what happened was he was, of course, encased in a crystal urn by this time because he's incorrupt. So a possessed woman was brought into the church where Blessed Anthony was, or his body was, I should say, and he was reclined. But when the possessed woman was brought into the church, the body of Blessed Anthony began to raise up, and his hands raised up in the position. That's still the position of the body now in Italy. And then he was moved after that to his hometown. He had been near Assisi, where he spent most of his life. But many miracles happened due to the intercession of Blessed Anthony. What is the common thread to these quite different stories? It had to do about why they did what they did. St. Giles Mary had this as his motto: think of and act only for God. That was the motto he had for his entire life. And that is the motto, which is the common thread for all three of the people which the church celebrates today. To think of and act only for God. This love of God was the burning force which drove all three of them. Because, according to the world, this is madness. The Franciscan observants were very poor. They gave up everything they had. They went into a friary. All glory of the world was gone. And therefore, for the eyes of the world, this is insanity. Because for them, you only have this world. You need to get what you can get in this world. Enjoy what you can in this world. But they gave up everything they had in this world for the next world, for God, for union with God. And so I think that all three of them are a great inspiration, and they should make, no matter for seminarians, lay people, or whatever, that thought of St. Giles Mary, to think of and live only for God, has got to be the motivating force for us. Because this world ends. We're not going to live forever. We're not going to have our possessions forever. We're not going to have anything of this life forever except where we stand before God. That and that only. That's the only thing we can carry with us, either for good or for ill. And hopefully for good, because this love of God begins heaven for us. These friars were not gloomy. They were not people who were just dragging through life, just waiting till the end of it. No, no, no. For them, heaven already started because God dwelt in their souls, and they were more and more aware of it the more the love of God grew in them. Everything for them was centered on God because they experienced God. And that's another thing we should be hopeful for. This life is not just one of dragging by, but the closer you draw to God, the more you know God in a quite different way than in a book. It's fine, a book. In fact, you're not going to know anything if you don't start out reading a book about God. The Catechism, for example, or spiritual reading, but it can't end there because God can't be found in a book. God exists, of course, in the Blessed Sacrament in second person in his sacred humanity, but he also dwells in your soul if you're in a state of grace. And he wishes you to experience him, which is why also in this Mass you have in the tract, I believe, taste and see that the Lord is good. To taste God. That's something common also to the saints. They didn't just believe it speculatively. They could taste God, they experienced God in the soul. Because as the love of God grows, then the awareness of God's presence in the soul grows with it. So let us take great comfort in these three today, the saint and the two blessed who gave themselves totally to God, that they would be model for us, no matter what our situation in life. That at least that burning love of God, that unicity in where they wanted to go, will be the one thing that characterizes us. Let us ask the Holy Virgin also, to whom they were all three greatly devoted. The Franciscan order is known as a great order in devotion to Our Lady. They were the ones who fought for the Immaculate Conception through thick and thin, never bending on that, until it was finally defined by Pope Pius IX, who himself was a Franciscan, third order. This love of Our Lady, she also had this burning drive for God, this burning love for God, in which God was the thing that bound all things together for her. So ask her intercession then, that she would inflame in our hearts through her intercession this burning love of God, so that we might find in God our all. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Dominus Vobiscum. Ius sia volento de exultant conspectu Dei et electentur